Welcome back, dear listener. Tonight, we're descending into the complete chronicle of the Murkoff Corporation and the unspeakable experiments that transformed ordinary people into vessels of horror. This is the full timeline of Outlast, a narrative that spans decades of corporate malfeasance, scientific ambition divorced from ethics, and the terrible price paid when humanity becomes nothing more than raw material for profit and power. From the CIA's Cold War experiments that laid the foundation for everything that followed, through the nightmarish events at Mount Massive Asylum, to the twisted religious fervor of Temple Gate, and into the desert facilities where reality itself became negotiable. We'll trace every thread, every connection, every quiet atrocity that contributed to one of horror's most disturbing mythologies. The story we're about to explore isn't merely about survival horror or corporate evil, though both play their parts. It's about what happens when the human mind is pushed beyond its breaking points, when consciousness is treated as software to be programmed, when suffering becomes data and trauma becomes technology. Each facility, each experiment, each victim represents another step in Murkoff's relentless pursuit of something that should have remained undiscovered. So settle into your covers, let your breathing slow, and allow this dark narrative to carry you toward rest. Feel free to leave a like if these chronicles help you find sleep, and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. There's something strangely comforting about knowing others are simultaneously exploring these shadowed corridors as they drift toward dreams. Let us begin our descent into the complete Outlast timeline. The Cold War Foundation. In the aftermath of World War II, as the world split into ideological camps and the threat of nuclear annihilation hung over humanity, intelligence agencies on both sides pursued every possible advantage. The United States Central Intelligence Agency, formed in 1947, inherited not just personnel and resources from its wartime predecessor, the OSS, but also a collection of Nazi scientists through Operation Paperclip, men whose expertise had been purchased with pardons for war crimes. Among these scientists was Dr. Rudolph Wernicke, whose work in German concentration camps had explored the furthest reaches of human consciousness under extreme duress. While his colleagues focused on rocketry and physics, Wernicke had studied something more ephemeral, the point at which the human mind, subjected to sufficient pressure, seemed to access capabilities beyond normal perception. His notes, written in coded German and hidden throughout the chaos of the Reich's fall, suggested discoveries that transcended conventional science. The CIA installed Wernicke in a facility designated Mount Massive Asylum, located in the remote mountains of Colorado. Officially, it was a psychiatric hospital serving the rural communities of the region. Unofficially, it was a black site where Project MKUltra's most extreme experiments could be conducted without oversight or moral constraint. The asylum's isolation, combined with its legitimate function as a mental health facility, provided perfect cover for activities that would have horrified the American public. Between 1948 and 1971, Wernicke oversaw experiments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and sanity. Subjects were drawn from the asylum's regular population, individuals already deemed mentally ill, whose testimony would be dismissed if they ever spoke of what they experienced. Veterans with shell shock, women diagnosed with hysteria, children labeled as defective, all became raw material for Wernicke's research. The experiments began with conventional approaches, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy pushed to extremes, cocktails of psychoactive drugs that had never been tested in combination. But Wernicke was searching for something specific, something he called the gateway. His wartime research had suggested that under the right conditions the human mind could perceive and interact with dimensions beyond the physical, could manifest thoughts as reality, could transcend the limitations of flesh. The breakthrough came in 1962 with a patient designated only as Subject 23. This individual, whose real name was carefully erased from all records, demonstrated abilities under Wernicke's treatments that defied scientific explanation. Electromagnetic fields fluctuated in his presence. Electronic equipment malfunctioned. Other patients reported shared nightmares featuring Subject 23, even when kept in isolation from each other. Most significantly, Subject 23 seemed capable of projecting his consciousness outside his body, observing events in distant locations with impossible accuracy. Wernicke called this phenomenon lucid dreaming, though it bore little resemblance to what sleep researchers meant by that term. This was consciousness freed from physical constraints, able to observe and potentially influence reality through pure mental projection. The implications for intelligence gathering were obvious. Imagine agents who could spy on enemies without leaving secure facilities, who could gather information through walls and across continents. The Morphogenic Engine. The challenge was replicating Subject 23's abilities in other individuals. Despite years of effort and hundreds of test subjects, Wernicke could not reliably induce the lucid dreaming state. The experiments grew more extreme, more desperate. Subjects were kept in induced comas for months, their brains stimulated with increasingly powerful electrical currents. Their bodies pushed to the very edge of death in hopes that proximity to mortality might trigger the desired transformation. The facility's basement levels were excavated and expanded, creating a warren of laboratories and containment cells that existed outside any official blueprint. Here, Wernicke constructed what he called the Morphogenic Engine, a massive apparatus that combined sensory deprivation tanks, electromagnetic field generators, and complex arrays of monitors designed to observe and influence brain activity at the cellular level. The Morphogenic Engine's purpose was to automate the process of creating lucid dreamers, to transform it from art to science. Subjects were suspended in tanks filled with conductive gel, their brain activity monitored and manipulated through thousands of microelectrodes. The engine would systematically trigger different combinations of stimuli visual patterns designed to induce specific brainwave states, audio frequencies that resonated with neural oscillations, chemical cocktails that altered neurotransmitter production. Most subjects who entered the Morphogenic Engine died or emerged in states of complete catatonia. But occasionally, perhaps 1 in 100, something different happened. These individuals, whom Wernicke designated as variants, displayed abilities similar to Subject 23. They could project their consciousness, observe distant locations, and in some cases, influence physical reality through mental effort alone. But the variants came with a terrible cost. The process that granted them their abilities also fractured their minds in fundamental ways. They experienced reality as fluid, uncertain, with the boundaries between dream and waking, between self and other, completely dissolved. Many became violent, unable to distinguish between their thoughts and external reality, acting out nightmares that they believed were real. Others retreated into catatonia, their consciousness dispersed so thoroughly that they could no longer inhabit their own bodies. The project faced a crisis in 1971 when 3 variants escaped containment simultaneously. The official record lists this as a fire that killed 12 staff members and 8 patients. The truth was more disturbing. The variants had somehow coordinated their escape, despite being kept in isolation, suggesting a form of telepathic communication. The damage they inflicted wasn't just physical, but psychological, with surviving staff members reporting nightmares and hallucinations that persisted for years afterward. Project shutdown and corporate transition. Following the 1971 incident and growing congressional scrutiny of CIA domestic operations, Project MKUltra was officially terminated. Documents were destroyed, facilities were closed, and personnel were reassigned or retired. Mount Massive Asylum returned to its cover function as a standard psychiatric facility, though the basement levels were sealed and abandoned rather than properly decommissioned. Rudolph Wernicke, now in his 80s, was relocated to a comfortable retirement in Switzerland, his war crimes forgotten, his research classified beyond any normal level of secrecy. The variants who survived were transferred to other facilities, or, in most cases, terminated to prevent further security breaches. Subject 23, the original success story, disappeared from records entirely. Some say he was executed, others that he escaped, still others that he simply ceased to exist in any way that could be documented. But Wernicke's research didn't disappear. Copies of his notes, fragments of the Morphogenic Engine's blueprints, and, most importantly, the theoretical framework for induced lucid dreaming, were preserved by individuals who recognized their potential value. These materials circulated through the shadow networks of intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and eventually into the hands of private corporations. The Murkoff Corporation emerged in the 1970s as a seemingly standard research and development contractor, working on mundane projects for various government agencies. Founded by a consortium of former CIA officers and defense industry executives, Murkoff specialized in projects that other contractors wouldn't touch: human testing protocols, enhanced interrogation techniques, psychological operations that skirted the edge of legality. By the 1990s, Murkoff had grown into a multinational corporation with facilities around the world. Its profits derived from an increasingly diverse portfolio that included private prisons, pharmaceutical research, and military contracts. But at its core, in departments that didn't appear on any organizational chart, Murkoff continued the work that Wernicke had begun. The corporation's leadership had become convinced that the Morphogenic Engine represented not just a tool for creating enhanced agents, but a fundamental breakthrough in human evolution. They envisioned a future where consciousness could be separated from flesh, where death was merely an inconvenience, where the human mind could be programmed and reprogrammed like software. The potential profits from such technology were incalculable. In 2003, Murkoff quietly purchased Mount Massive Asylum through a series of shell companies. The facility had been struggling financially for years, its remote location and aging infrastructure making it increasingly unsuitable for modern psychiatric care. Murkoff promised to revitalize the asylum, to transform it into a cutting-edge treatment facility. Local officials, desperate for the jobs and tax revenue, didn't look too closely at the details. The modern revival under Murkoff's ownership, Mount Massive underwent extensive renovations. Officially, these were updates to bring the facility up to modern standards. Unofficially, Murkoff was excavating the sealed basement levels, recovering Wernicke's abandoned equipment, and preparing to resume the experiments that had been interrupted decades earlier. The corporation had several advantages that Wernicke had lacked. Modern brain imaging technology allowed for real-time observation of neural activity. Pharmaceutical advances provided more precise tools for altering consciousness. Most importantly, Murkoff had access to a much larger pool of test subjects through its private prison contracts, individuals whose disappearance would raise few questions. Dr. Richard Traeger was brought in to oversee the medical aspects of the renewed program. A brilliant surgeon whose medical license had been revoked for unauthorized experiments, Traeger saw Mount Massive as an opportunity to pursue research unencumbered by ethical constraints. He believed that the human body was simply a machine that could be modified, improved, or discarded as necessary. The initial experiments focused on recreating Wernicke's original success with the Morphogenic Engine. The device was rebuilt using modern components, its capabilities expanded through computer control systems that could monitor and adjust thousands of variables simultaneously. Subjects were prepared through weeks of conditioning, sleep deprivation, nutritional manipulation, exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies before being placed in the engine itself. The results were mixed but promising from Murkoff's perspective. While the rate of successful variant creation remained low, those who survived the process displayed even more pronounced abilities than Wernicke's original subjects. Some could not just observe distant locations but influence them, causing electronic malfunctions or even physical disturbances through purely mental effort. Others seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime, appearing in multiple locations simultaneously or accessing information from past or future events. But the modern variants also displayed new and disturbing characteristics. Many developed what could only be described as a hostile relationship with reality itself. They didn't just experience hallucinations, they seemed to generate them, creating pockets of altered reality that affected anyone in their proximity. Staff members working with variants reported persistent nightmares, lost time, and in some cases physical symptoms with no medical explanation. The Walrider project, the breakthrough that would ultimately doom Mount Massive, came from an unexpected source. Billy Hope, a former Marine who had been sentenced to death for murdering 3 civilians in Afghanistan, was selected for the program due to his exceptional physical condition and psychological profile that suggested high resistance to mental stress. When Hope was subjected to the Morphogenic Engine, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of simply developing variant abilities, he became a host for something else entirely, an entity that Murkoff scientists dubbed the Walrider. This wasn't just a projection of Hope's consciousness, but something that seemed to have independent existence, a swarm of nanoscopic particles that could assume physical form, controlled by Hope's mind but not entirely subordinate to his will. The Walrider defied conventional understanding, It could pass through solid matter, generate enormous physical force, and, most disturbingly, transfer between hosts under certain conditions. It appeared as a dark cloud of particulate matter, vaguely humanoid in shape but constantly shifting, like smoke given murderous intent. Temperature dropped in its presence, electronics failed, and those who observed it directly reported an overwhelming sense of existential dread. Murkoff's executives saw the Walrider as the ultimate achievement, a weaponized consciousness that could be deployed anywhere, unstoppable by conventional defenses. They immediately began planning for mass production, envisioning armies of Walrider hosts that could be controlled through psychological conditioning and technological restraints. But containing the Walrider proved more difficult than anticipated. Billy Hope, despite being kept in a medically induced coma and physically restrained, seemed to be growing stronger. The Walrider's manifestations became more frequent and violent. It began appearing throughout the facility, attacking staff members seemingly at random, though later analysis suggested it was targeting individuals involved in particularly cruel experiments. Dr. Rudolph Wernicke, now over 100 years old but kept alive through experimental treatments, was brought back to Mount Massive to consult on the Walrider problem. He was horrified by what Murkoff had created, recognizing that they had opened a door that should have remained closed. In his final reports, he wrote of the Walrider not as a tool, but as a consequence the price for violating boundaries that existed for reasons humanity wasn't equipped to understand. The whistleblower within Mount Massive's sprawling hierarchy, not everyone was comfortable with the experiments being conducted. Wayland Park, a software engineer hired to maintain the asylum's computer systems, gradually became aware of the horrors occurring in the restricted sections of the facility. His position gave him access to email archives, security footage, and database records that painted a picture of systematic atrocity. Park discovered that the patients being used for experiments weren't just prisoners, but also included homeless individuals, undocumented immigrants, and in some cases, people who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The consent forms they signed were forgeries. The oversight committee that supposedly monitored the experiments didn't exist. The entire operation was a black box, invisible to any external authority. What disturbed Park most was the casual cruelty documented in the records. Researchers discussed test subjects like equipment, noting their breakdown and disposal with no more emotion than they would apply to faulty machinery. Email threads debated the cost-effectiveness of keeping subjects alive versus acquiring new ones. Progress reports celebrated successful variant creation while dismissing the hundreds of failures as acceptable losses. Park began compiling evidence, secretly copying files and preparing to expose Murkoff's activities to the world. But he underestimated the corporation's surveillance capabilities. His activities were detected, and before he could release his information, Park found himself reclassified from employee to patient, subjected to the same experiments he had been documenting. The psychological preparation Park underwent before his session in the Morphogenic Engine was particularly cruel. Designed by staff who saw his betrayal as personal, he was forced to watch recordings of other subjects' experiments, kept awake for days with stimulants, subjected to scenarios designed to break down his sense of identity and reality. the goal wasn't just to create another variant, but to punish him for his attempted whistleblowing. Meanwhile, Park had managed to send one email before his capture, a desperate plea for help directed to investigative journalist Miles Upshur. The message was vague, cryptic, but included just enough specific information to be credible. Upshur, who had been investigating Murkoff for years, recognized the opportunity to finally expose the corporation's activities. Miles Upshur's investigation. Miles Upshur arrived at Mount Massive on a night when the atmospheric pressure was dropping and storm clouds gathered over the mountains. He came alone, equipped with only a camcorder and a determination to document whatever was happening inside the asylum. The main gate was mysteriously open, the guard booth abandoned, its windows splattered with something dark that might have been blood, or might have been something worse. The facility's exterior lights were functioning sporadically, creating pools of darkness that seemed to swallow sound. Upshur's camcorder, equipped with night vision capabilities, became his primary means of navigation as he entered through a window that had been shattered from the inside. Glass scattered outward in patterns that suggested explosive force. What Upshur found inside Mount Massive defied his worst expectations. The asylum was in chaos. Patients wandered freely through corridors painted with blood. Staff members' bodies lay in positions suggesting they had died trying to escape something, and the very architecture seemed to have been damaged by forces that couldn't be easily explained. Walls showed impact patterns too large to be human. Ceilings had holes that opened onto darkness, and in some areas the temperature had dropped so dramatically that frost covered the surfaces. The first coherent survivor Upshur encountered was Father Martin Archambaud, a patient who had fashioned himself into a prophet of what he called the Gospel of the Walrider. Martin spoke of the entity as a god that would cleanse the world, that would punish the wicked and elevate the faithful. He had gathered followers among the patients, individuals whose minds had been shattered by experiments and who found comfort in Martin's apocalyptic vision. Martin guided Upshur deeper into the facility, past makeshift barricades where patients had created their own feudal territories, through sections where reality seemed unstable, where the walls themselves appeared to pulse with organic rhythm. The Father spoke of trials that Upshur must face, of worthiness that must be proven, of revelation that awaited those who survived the journey. Chris Walker, a former military police officer who had volunteered for the Morphogenic Engine experiments, had become something barely recognizable as human. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, his body grotesquely muscled beyond natural limits, Walker patrolled the asylum with singular purpose to contain the Walrider by killing anyone who might serve as its host. His methods were brutal but effective, tearing heads from bodies with his bare hands to ensure no consciousness remained that the entity could inhabit. The underground laboratory. Descending into Mount Massive's lower levels, Upshur discovered the true scope of Murkoff's experiments. The underground laboratory stretched for multiple floors beneath the asylum, a complex that dwarfed the surface facility. Here, hundreds of morphogenic engines operated simultaneously, each containing a test subject in various stages of transformation. The power requirements for this operation were enormous, supplied by a geothermal plant that tapped into volcanic activity deep beneath the mountains. The heat from this system created a hellish environment in the lowest levels, where temperatures could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air was thick with chemical vapors from the experiments. Dr. Richard Trager had established his own domain in the medical wing, where he conducted surgeries that he insisted were therapeutic, but which seemed designed primarily to satisfy his curiosity about human anatomy under extreme conditions. He had removed his own fingers and replaced them with surgical implements, transforming himself into a living tool for his obsessions. Trager captured Upshur, strapping him to a gurney for what he called therapy. The procedure involved the amputation of fingers, which Trager performed with disturbing cheerfulness, discussing the benefits of accepting one's helplessness while cauterizing the wounds with practiced efficiency. Upshur's escape required him to navigate the medical wing while bleeding and in shock, pursued by a man who saw mutilation as medicine. The twins, identified in records only as Subject 34A and 34B, represented one of Murkoff's few successful attempts at creating synchronized variants. These identical brothers had developed a shared consciousness through their exposure to the Morphogenic Engine, able to coordinate perfectly despite being physically separated. They hunted through the asylum as a unit, one driving prey toward the other, their movements suggesting a hive mind that transcended individual identity. Eddie Gluskin, known among the patients as the Groom, had been subjected to experiments focusing on sexual trauma and conditioning. The treatments had fractured his mind in specific ways, creating a personality that oscillated between desperate romanticism and violent misogyny. He had claimed a section of the vocational building where he attempted to transform other patients into brides, performing crude surgeries to feminize their bodies before invariably deciding they were inadequate and murdering them. The Walrider Revelation. In the depths of the facility, Upshur finally discovered the source of the Walrider Billy Hope. Suspended in a massive sphere filled with fluid, his body kept alive by machines, while his consciousness projected the entity. The sphere was surrounded by monitoring equipment that tracked every aspect of Hope's biological functions, adjusting chemical mixtures and electrical stimulation to maintain his state between life and death. Wernicke appeared to Upshur through a failing life support system, his ancient body finally surrendering to time. He explained that the Walrider was not truly a separate entity, but a projection of Hope's consciousness given form through nanotechnology that Murkoff had developed. These nanobots, invisible to the naked eye but numbering in the trillions, could assemble into physical structures controlled by Hope's mind. The only way to stop the Walrider, Wernicke revealed, was to kill its host. But this was complicated by the fact that the entity had grown beyond Hope's control. It was no longer simply a projection, but had developed its own quasi-consciousness, a gestalt formed from Hope's trauma and rage combined with the programming of the nanobots. Killing Hope might not destroy the Walrider, but merely free it to seek a new host. Upshur, despite his injuries and exhaustion, managed to reach the controls for Hope's life support system. The decision to terminate Hope was not made lightly. This was essentially murdering a man who had been tortured into becoming a weapon. But with the Walrider rampaging through the facility and threatening to escape into the wider world, there seemed to be no alternative. As Hope's vital signs flatlined, the Walrider's manifestation became erratic, violent, unfocused. It swept through the laboratory like a hurricane of darkness, destroying equipment and killing remaining staff members indiscriminately. But instead of dissipating as Wernicke had predicted, it seemed to be searching for something or someone. The transfer. The Walrider found its new host in Miles Upshur. The transfer wasn't voluntary or even conscious. The entity simply invaded Upshur's body at the moment when his own death seemed certain. Military contractors sent by Murkoff to contain the situation opened fire on Upshur as he attempted to escape, their bullets tearing through his flesh. But as he fell, the Walrider entered him, using his dying consciousness as an anchor to maintain its existence in the physical world. What emerged from Mount Massive Asylum was neither Miles Upshur nor the Walrider, but a fusion of both. Upshur's consciousness filtered through the trauma of what he had witnessed and experienced, merged with the entity's alien intelligence. The result was something new, a being with human memories and motivations powered by inhuman capabilities. The military contractors who had shot Upshur became the first victims of this new hybrid. The Walrider, now guided by Upshur's rage against Murkoff, tore through them with casual efficiency. Vehicles were overturned, weapons were rendered useless, and within minutes the containment team was eliminated. The entity then disappeared into the night, leaving Mount Massive burning behind it. Murkoff's response was swift and comprehensive. The asylum was officially destroyed in what was reported as a gas explosion. The few surviving patients were transferred to other facilities or simply disappeared. Records were destroyed or classified beyond any normal level of access. Within days, it was as if Mount Massive Asylum had never existed except as a tragic footnote in local history. But Wayland Park had survived. Hidden in the asylum during the chaos, he had documented everything with his own camera. His footage, combined with files he had managed to preserve, provided irrefutable evidence of Murkoff's crimes. He released this information to media outlets worldwide, expecting it to trigger investigations, arrests, and the dissolution of the corporation. Instead, the revelations were dismissed as elaborate hoaxes. The footage was labeled as fake, created with special effects. Expert witnesses, many of whom were secretly on Murkoff's payroll, testified that the documented experiments were scientifically impossible. Park himself was discredited as a disgruntled employee with a history of mental illness. The truth was buried beneath layers of disinformation and legal threats. Templegate, the radio tower experiment. While Mount Massive burned, Murkoff had already been conducting parallel experiments at other sites. In the Arizona desert, hidden within a box canyon accessible only by helicopter, lay the isolated community of Templegate. This wasn't a medical facility, but something perhaps more insidious, an entire town that served as a testing ground for mass psychological manipulation. Templegate had been founded in the 1960s by Sullivan Knoth, a charismatic preacher who had led his followers into the wilderness to await the end times. The community had thrived in isolation, developing its own interpretation of Christianity that blended biblical prophecy with Knoth's increasingly elaborate visions. By the time Murkoff discovered them, Templegate had become a self-sustaining society of true believers, perfect subjects for experimentation. Murkoff's interest in Temple Gate centered on their radio tower experiments. Building on research from the Morphogenic Engine, they had developed technology that could broadcast specific frequencies that affected human consciousness. These signals, undetectable to conscious perception, could induce hallucinations, alter emotional states and insufficient concentration, cause physical symptoms ranging from nausea to spontaneous abortion. The radio towers were disguised as communication relays, supposedly providing the isolated community with connection to the outside world. In reality, they were broadcasting carefully calibrated signals designed to test the limits of mass psychogenic illness. The entire population of Temple Gate became unwitting test subjects in an experiment to see if religious delusions could be artificially induced and controlled. The effects were gradual but profound. Knoth's visions became more frequent and elaborate, featuring specific imagery that Murkoff's signals were designed to evoke. He began preaching about the birth of the Antichrist, about the need for purification through suffering, about dreams where angels spoke to him in frequencies that hurt to hear. His followers, exposed to the same signals, experienced similar visions, creating a feedback loop of shared delusion. The community began to fracture along lines that Murkoff had deliberately engineered. A splinter group led by Val, one of Knoth's former disciples, rejected his increasingly extreme doctrine and formed their own sect devoted to what they saw as the true revelation. These heretics, as Knoth's followers called them, had been exposed to different frequencies that induced alternative hallucinations, creating an opposing theology that ensured conflict. Blake and Lynn Langermann. Into this carefully orchestrated madness came Blake and Lynn Langermann, investigative journalists following up on the mysterious murder of a pregnant woman found in rural Arizona. Their helicopter crashed in the canyon containing Temple Gate, an accident that Murkoff's records would later suggest might not have been entirely accidental. Blake and Lynn were separated immediately, with Lynn captured by Knoth's followers who believed she was pregnant with the Antichrist, despite medical impossibility given their recent history. Blake's journey through Temple Gate became a descent through layers of artificially induced religious psychosis, where every inhabitant was experiencing visions that reinforced their particular interpretation of unfolding apocalypse. Blake's own exposure to the radio signals triggered something unexpected: repressed memories of childhood trauma at a Catholic school, where his friend Jessica had died under mysterious circumstances possibly involving a predatory teacher. The Murkoff signals, designed to evoke religious imagery, instead unlocked Blake's buried guilt and trauma, causing him to experience vivid hallucinations of his school days overlaid on the present reality of Temple Gate. The heretics, living in the mines beneath the canyon, had developed their own culture in response to the signals they received. They practiced extreme body modification, sexual rituals, and crucifixion, believing that suffering was the path to transcendence. Val, their leader, had been transformed by years of exposure into something barely recognizable as the person who had once been Knoth's most devoted follower. Lynn's supposed pregnancy accelerated at an impossible rate, going from conception to full term in a matter of hours. This was not a real pregnancy, but a shared hallucination so powerful that it produced physical symptoms. The Murkoff signals had successfully created what researchers termed a phantom pregnancy that multiple people could observe and interact with despite its non-existence. The birth scene was a masterpiece of induced mass hysteria. Knoth's followers saw the Antichrist being born. The heretics saw their prophet arriving. Blake saw his wife dying in childbirth. Lynn herself experienced labor pains and delivery of a child that didn't exist. The radio signals had created a consensual hallucination so complete that it became functionally real for those experiencing it. The collapse of Temple Gate. As the phantom birth reached its climax, the Murkoff experiment achieved an unexpected result. The concentration of signals required to maintain the mass hallucination caused a resonance effect that began to damage the geological structure of the canyon itself. The box canyon that contained Temple Gate started to destabilize, with rock slides and earthquakes suggesting imminent collapse. Knoth, driven to complete madness by years of exposure to the signals, murdered his followers in a mass suicide event, believing it would prevent the Antichrist from claiming their souls. The heretics, equally affected, engaged in their own apocalyptic rituals. The entire community self-destructed in a matter of hours, exactly as Murkoff's theoretical models had predicted. Blake survived, but was found days later by Murkoff cleanup teams, catatonic and clutching a bundle of cloth he insisted contained his child. Medical examination revealed no infant, but Blake's brain showed patterns consistent with extreme exposure to the radio frequencies. He was institutionalized, his testimony dismissed as the ravings of a man who had suffered a psychotic break. Lynn's body was recovered and showed signs of extreme physical stress consistent with childbirth, despite autopsy revealing she had never been pregnant. This paradox became a subject of intense study within Murkoff's research division. How could a hallucination produce genuine physical effects? The implications for the nature of reality itself were disturbing. The Temple Gate experiment was deemed a qualified success. Murkoff had proven that entire communities could be driven to self-destruction through targeted psychological manipulation. The applications for warfare, population control, and social engineering were obvious. The corporation began planning larger-scale implementations, despite the total loss of the test population. Project Walrider Resurrection. Despite the destruction of Mount Massive, Murkoff had not abandoned the Walrider project. The entity's successful transfer to Miles Upshur had proven that it could survive its original host's death. This suggested possibilities that the corporation was eager to explore. If the Walrider could be transferred between hosts, could it be controlled? Could multiple Walriders be created? Could the technology be refined and weaponized? A new facility was constructed in the Sonoran Desert, far from any population centers, built to specifications that incorporated everything learned from Mount Massive's failure. This installation, designated Site Sierra, was designed from the ground up to contain and control Morphogenic Engine test subjects. Every surface was reinforced. Every system had multiple redundancies, and, most importantly, the entire facility could be sealed and flooded with nerve gas if containment was breached. The new research team, led by Dr. Jennifer Rowland, took a different approach from their predecessors. Instead of trying to create variants through trauma and suffering, they hypothesized that willing participants might achieve better results. They recruited from extreme sports enthusiasts, meditation practitioners, and individuals who had reported spontaneous out-of-body experiences. The idea was that people already inclined toward altered consciousness might more easily achieve the lucid dreaming state. Initial results were promising. The volunteer subjects showed higher survival rates and more stable variant manifestations. But a disturbing pattern emerged. These willing variants were even more dangerous than those created through trauma. Their abilities were more controlled, but also more ambitious. Several attempted to use their powers to escape not just the facility, but physical reality itself, trying to project their consciousness permanently into what they described as higher dimensions. The most successful of these volunteers was a former astronaut named Maria Chen, who had experienced what she called a cognitive shift during a spacewalk. Under the Morphogenic Engine's influence, Chen developed abilities that exceeded anything previously documented. She could observe and influence events across vast distances, seemingly violate causality by accessing information from the future, and, most disturbingly, alter other people's perceptions of reality. Chen claimed that the Morphogenic Engine hadn't given her these abilities, but had simply revealed capabilities that all humans possessed but couldn't normally access. She spoke of consciousness as fundamental to the universe, with physical reality being merely one expression of infinite possibility. Her sessions in the engine became increasingly abstract, with monitoring equipment registering energies and frequencies that shouldn't exist according to known physics. The Signala Facility. While Site Sierra explored voluntary transformation, Murkoff's Signala facility in Southeast Asia took yet another approach. Built in a region with a long history of spiritual and mystical traditions, Signala attempted to combine modern technology with ancient practices that supposedly allowed communion with other realms. The facility recruited local shamans, monks, and spiritual practitioners, studying their techniques and attempting to replicate them technologically. They discovered that certain meditative practices produced brainwave patterns similar to those observed in variants, suggesting that the Morphogenic Engine might be a technological shortcut to states that some humans could achieve naturally. Dr. Amara Krishnamurthy, Signala's lead researcher, had spent years studying consciousness in both scientific and spiritual contexts. She believed that the variants and the Walrider were touching something that mystics had been aware of for millennia, a layer of reality where thought and form were indistinguishable, where consciousness could directly manipulate the physical world. The experiments at Signala incorporated elements that would have seemed absurd at Mount Massive meditation chambers with specific acoustic properties, geometric patterns based on sacred mathematics, even ritualistic practices adapted from various spiritual traditions. The scientific method was being stretched to accommodate phenomena that didn't fit within materialist paradigms. Surprisingly, this approach yielded unique results. Subjects at Signala developed abilities that were less violent but more profound than typical variants. They could heal injuries through mental focus, influence plant growth, and, in one documented case, apparently teleport small objects across short distances. These abilities came without the usual psychological fracturing, suggesting that the trauma-based approach might have been unnecessarily cruel. But Signala had its own problems. Several subjects claimed to be in communication with entities from other dimensions, beings they described as neither benevolent nor malevolent, but utterly alien to human understanding. These entities supposedly existed in the spaces between realities, feeding on consciousness itself. The subjects insisted that the Morphogenic Engine and similar technologies were creating breaches that allowed these entities greater access to our world. The trials. As Murkoff's various facilities continued their experiments, a new phase of the project began field trials of variant abilities in real-world scenarios. Small teams of successfully transformed subjects were deployed on corporate missions, their activities hidden within conventional military and intelligence operations. The first documented field trial, codenamed Operation Lighthouse, involved using a variant to gather intelligence from a rival corporation's secure facility. The variant, designated Agent Sigma, successfully projected consciousness into the target building, observing meetings and accessing computer systems through purely mental interface. The intelligence gathered was accurate and valuable. But Agent Sigma returned from the mission changed, speaking of others in the projection space who had been watching him. Subsequent trials revealed consistent problems. Variants operating in populated areas reported feeling overwhelmed by the collective unconscious of nearby humans. Cities became psychic maelstroms, where thousands of minds created interference that made projection difficult and dangerous. Several variants attempted operations in urban environments and never returned to their bodies, their consciousness apparently lost in the noise of mass humanity. Rural operations were more successful, but brought their own challenges. Variants reported that certain locations seemed to have their own consciousness forests that watched, mountains that remembered, deserts that dreamed. These anthropomorphizations might have been psychological projections, but the consistency of reports across different variants suggested something more. The most ambitious trial, Operation Erebus, attempted to use multiple variants working in concert to influence a political election in a small nation. The variants were tasked with projecting specific thoughts and emotions to key individuals, subtly manipulating their decisions. The operation technically succeeded the Murkoff-favored candidate 1, but all 5 variants involved suffered complete psychological breakdown afterward, unable to distinguish between their own thoughts and those they had manipulated. These trials demonstrated that while variant abilities were real and potentially useful, they came with costs that made large-scale deployment problematic. Every use of these abilities seemed to erode the barrier between the user's consciousness and the collective unconscious, between individual identity and something larger and more diffuse. The Outlast trials. Recognizing the limitations of individual variants, Murkoff initiated a new program called the Outlast Trials. This project aimed to create teams of lesser variants who could work together, their combined abilities exceeding what any individual could achieve, while hopefully distributing the psychological cost across multiple subjects. The trials took place in a specially constructed facility that combined elements from all previous Murkoff sites. Test subjects, now called reagents, were exposed to controlled doses of Morphogenic Engine radiation while participating in elaborate scenarios designed to trigger specific psychological states. The goal was to create variants with limited but stable abilities that could be activated and deactivated as needed. Reagents were recruited from vulnerable populations, prisoners, refugees, people with no family or connections who wouldn't be missed. They were told they were participating in advanced therapy that would cure their various psychological ailments. The consent forms they signed were masterpieces of legal obscurity, technically accurate but impossible for laypersons to understand. The trials themselves were elaborate theatrical productions. Reagents were placed in environments designed to evoke specific fears: abandoned police stations, derelict orphanages, corrupted carnival grounds. They faced challenges that required cooperation, but also created opportunities for betrayal. Every action was monitored, every physiological response recorded, every moment of transformation documented. Successful reagents, those who survived and showed variant potential, were subjected to increasingly intense trials. They were exposed to other reagents who had been deliberately driven insane, forced to navigate spaces where reality was chemically altered, confronted with physical manifestations of their own psychological traumas. The process was designed to break down individual identity while building group cohesion. The most successful team, designated Cell 7, achieved something unprecedented. During a particularly intense trial, all 4 members simultaneously experienced what they described as cognitive fusion. For several minutes, they existed as a single consciousness distributed across 4 bodies. They could coordinate perfectly, share sensory information, and even temporarily transfer injuries between bodies. But when the fusion ended, none of them could clearly remember which thoughts and memories were originally their own. The Skinner Man. Among the various entities created or discovered through Murkoff's experiments, one stood apart in its apparent autonomy and malevolence the creature personnel dubbed the Skinner Man. This being first appeared at the Mount Massive site, but seemed to exist independently of any specific host or technological origin. The Skinner Man manifested as a tall, emaciated figure whose skin appeared to have been flayed and reattached incorrectly, creating a patchwork of scars and exposed tissue. Unlike the Walrider or typical variants, the Skinner Man showed no connection to any test subject. It simply appeared in facilities conducting morphogenic experiments, as if drawn by the psychic disturbances these created. What made the Skinner Man particularly disturbing was its apparent intelligence and purpose. It didn't attack randomly, but seemed to select victims based on criteria no one could determine. It would ignore some individuals entirely while relentlessly pursuing others. Survivors reported that it seemed to be looking for something specific, examining people as if searching for a particular quality or characteristic. Dr. Patricia Vaughn, one of the few researchers to survive extended contact with the Skinner Man, theorized that it was not a creation of the experiments, but something that had always existed in the spaces between dimensions, only now able to manifest due to the breaches created by morphogenic technology. She described it as a psychic scavenger, feeding on the consciousness fragments left behind by failed variants. The Skinner Man's appearances became more frequent as Murkoff expanded its experiments. It was sited at Site Sierra, Signala, and multiple trial facilities. Each appearance coincided with significant breakthroughs or disasters in the morphogenic program, as if it were attracted to moments when the barrier between realities was thinnest. Attempts to capture or study the Skinner man failed consistently. It could phase through solid matter like the Walrider, but seemed to do so through different means. Electronic surveillance equipment malfunctioned in its presence, but not through electromagnetic interference. The devices simply refused to record it, as if reality itself rejected the possibility of its documentation. Most disturbing were reports that the Skinner man could exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Confirmed sightings placed it at facilities on different continents at the exact same time. This suggested either multiple entities or a single being that transcended conventional space-time limitations. Technological evolution. As Murkoff's understanding of consciousness manipulation grew, their technology evolved beyond the crude mechanical apparatus of the original Morphogenic Engine. New devices were developed that could induce variant states through more subtle means, targeted electromagnetic fields, synthetic compounds that mimicked the brain chemistry of natural variants, even software that could trigger transformation through visual and auditory stimuli. The most advanced of these technologies was the neural bridge, a network of quantum computers that could map and manipulate consciousness in real time. Unlike the morphogenic engine, which forced transformation through trauma, the neural bridge could guide the subjects through the process gradually, adjusting its approach based on individual psychological profiles. The neural bridge revealed something unexpected about the nature of variant abilities. The projection and manipulation capabilities weren't additions to normal consciousness but revelations of capacities that always existed but were normally suppressed. The human brain, it seemed, actively limited its own abilities to maintain stable individual identity. The various Murkoff technologies simply removed these limitations, with typically catastrophic results. This discovery led to a new approach. Instead of trying to create permanent variants, why not develop a technology that could temporarily unlock these abilities when needed? The cognitive enhancement suit was Murkoff's attempt at this solution, a wearable device that could induce controlled variant states for limited periods. Early tests of the enhancement suit were promising. Subjects could project their consciousness for minutes at a time without permanent psychological damage. But repeated use created cumulative effects. Each session made it harder for subjects to fully return to normal consciousness. They reported persistent feelings of disconnection, as if part of them remained in the projection space. The suit also had an unexpected interaction with the collective unconscious. Users reported encountering other consciousnesses in the projection space, not just other variants or test subjects, but ordinary people experiencing dreams or altered states. The suit was somehow tapping into a layer of reality where all human consciousness intersected. The Sleeper Project, Murkoff's most ambitious project, began in secret even from most of the corporation's leadership. The Sleeper Project aimed to create a network of dormant variants scattered throughout the general population. Individuals who could be activated remotely when needed. The project used a modified version of the radio tower technology tested at Temple Gate, broadcasting signals that would gradually prepare selected individuals for transformation. These signals were embedded in cell phone networks, television broadcasts, and internet streaming services. Millions of people were exposed to low-level morphogenic conditioning without their knowledge. Most people experienced no noticeable effects from this exposure, but approximately 1 in 10,000 showed signs of latent variant potential increased dream vividness, occasional out-of-body experiences, moments of apparent precognition. These individuals were identified through data mining of medical records, social media posts, and consumer behavior patterns that suggested unusual consciousness states. Once identified, potential sleepers were subjected to more targeted conditioning. Their devices would receive customized signals designed to enhance their latent abilities. They might be directed through algorithm manipulation to content that would trigger specific psychological states. Some were even approached with job offers or other opportunities that would bring them closer to Murkoff facilities. The goal was to create thousands of sleepers who could be activated simultaneously, creating a psychic network that could influence events on a global scale. Murkoff envisioned scenarios where sleepers could manipulate stock markets through collective consciousness, influence political decisions, or even alter physical reality through coordinated projection. But the Sleeper Project had an unintended consequence. The conditioning signals, while too weak to affect most people consciously, were having cumulative effects on the collective unconscious. Reports of shared dreams increased globally. Mass hysteria events became more common. Reality itself seemed to be becoming less stable, more susceptible to belief and perception. The collapse phenomenon. As Murkoff's various projects expanded, a new problem emerged that threatened the entire enterprise. Researchers began calling it the collapse phenomenon, a cascade failure that occurred when too many consciousness manipulation experiments operated in proximity. The first documented collapse occurred at a facility in northern Canada where 3 different Morphogenic Engine variants were being tested simultaneously. Without warning, the barrier between normal reality and the projection space didn't just thin, it shattered entirely. The facility existed simultaneously in multiple states, with different sections experiencing different versions of reality. Staff members reported being in multiple locations at once, experiencing past and future events simultaneously, and encountering versions of themselves from alternate timelines. The variants at the center of the collapse were found fused at a molecular level. Their consciousness merged into something that communicated only in mathematical equations that described impossible geometries. The collapse lasted for 73 hours before reality reasserted itself. When it ended, the facility had been fundamentally altered. Corridors led to rooms that shouldn't exist. Gravity worked differently in certain areas, and, most disturbing, some staff members had been replaced by versions of themselves with different memories and personalities. Murkoff attempted to study the collapse phenomenon, but each investigation seemed to increase the likelihood of another occurrence. It was as if reality had developed antibodies against their experiments, actively resisting attempts to manipulate consciousness on a large scale. The corporation's response was to distribute their facilities more widely, keeping experiments separated by hundreds of miles. But the collapses continued, suggesting that physical distance was less important than some other factor, perhaps the total amount of consciousness manipulation occurring globally, regardless of location. The Revelation Documents. In 2017, a massive data breach exposed thousands of Murkoff's internal documents to the public. The leak, orchestrated by a group of hackers who claimed to be former test subjects, revealed the full scope of the corporation's activities. The documents included experiment, logs, video footage, and detailed descriptions of the various projects. The public reaction was not what the leakers expected. Instead of outrage and demands for justice, the revelations were largely dismissed as an elaborate hoax. The documentation was too horrible, too extensive, too impossible to be real. Conspiracy theorists embraced it, which paradoxically made it easier for mainstream sources to dismiss. Murkoff's response was brilliant in its simplicity. They claimed the leaked documents were part of an alternate reality game, a marketing campaign for a new entertainment franchise. They released video games based on the fictional experiments, movies that depicted sanitized versions of the events, and even a theme park attraction that turned Mount Massive Asylum into a haunted house experience. By commercializing their own atrocities, Murkoff made them unbelievable. The truth became entertainment, and entertainment obscured the truth. Survivors who came forward were dismissed as actors or attention seekers. The few journalists who tried to investigate further faced legal action, professional destruction, or, in some cases, simply disappeared. But the leaked documents had another effect. They served as a trigger for latent sleepers around the world. People who had been unknowingly conditioned by Murkoff's signals suddenly had context for their experiences. Some sought out others like themselves, forming communities of individuals who shared unusual consciousness experiences. Others tried to enhance their abilities, experimenting with techniques described in the leaked files. The current state. As we reach the present day in our timeline, Murkoff Corporation continues to operate, though in evolved forms. The crude physical experiments of Mount Massive have given way to more subtle approaches. The corporation has learned that consciousness manipulation doesn't require torture chambers and surgical modification. It can be achieved through targeted media, pharmaceutical interventions, and environmental modifications. Modern Murkoff facilities look nothing like asylums or laboratories. They resemble tech company campuses, wellness retreats, or research hospitals. The test subjects often don't know they're test subjects, believing they're receiving cutting-edge medical treatment or participating in mindfulness studies. The Morphogenic Engine has been miniaturized and refined, its effects delivered through seemingly benign technologies. The Walrider, if it still exists with Miles Upshur or has found new hosts, remains unconfirmed but suspected in various unexplained events around the world. Power grids failing in perfect spirals, security cameras capturing shadows that move independently, witnesses describing a presence that exists at the edge of perception. These might be coincidences, or might be evidence of the entity's continued existence. The variants created through decades of experiments are scattered globally. Some live in hiding, trying to suppress abilities they never wanted. Others work for Murkoff or its competitors, their consciousness-manipulating capabilities making them valuable assets in corporate espionage and warfare. Still, others have disappeared entirely, perhaps existing more in projection space than physical reality. New religions and philosophical movements have emerged around the concept of consciousness expansion, many unknowingly based on Murkoff research. These groups practice techniques that inch toward variant states, though most lack the technology or knowledge to achieve full transformation. They speak of awakening humanity to its true potential, unaware that this potential comes with costs they're not prepared to pay. The radio frequencies that drove Temple Gate to destruction are still broadcasting from various sources, though at levels below conscious perception. The cumulative effect on human consciousness is impossible to measure, but might explain increasing reports of shared experiences, prophetic dreams, and reality anomalies that were once dismissed as imagination. Future implications. Murkoff's experiments have potentially changed the nature of human consciousness itself. By repeatedly breaching the barriers between individual minds and collective experience, between physical and psychological reality, they may have permanently altered how consciousness operates on a species level. Children born after the experiments began show subtle differences from previous generations. They score higher on tests of intuition and pattern recognition. They report dreams that seem to connect to real events. Some demonstrate abilities that might be early expressions of natural variant states, knowing things they shouldn't know, influencing probabilities through focused intention, occasionally seeming to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. The medical establishment has begun recognizing new psychological conditions that might be related to Murkoff's influence. Consciousness displacement disorder, where individuals feel their awareness shifting between bodies. Reality coherence dysfunction, where patients perceive multiple versions of events simultaneously. Projection syndrome, where dreams and hallucinations affect physical reality in measurable ways. Environmental changes might also be connected to the experiments. Areas where intensive consciousness manipulation occurred show persistent anomalies, electromagnetic variations, temperature fluctuations that follow no natural pattern, and, most disturbing, reports of thin spaces, where the boundary between dimensions seems compromised. The corporate world has quietly integrated Murkoff's discoveries into various industries. Advertising that targets the unconscious mind with unprecedented precision. Entertainment that can induce specific emotional and psychological states. Architecture designed to influence behavior through geometric patterns that affect consciousness. The transformation of humanity might not come through dramatic experiments, but through gradual, commercially driven modification. The philosophy of horror. What Murkoff's timeline ultimately reveals is a fundamental question about the nature of consciousness and reality. If consciousness can influence physical reality, if individual minds can merge and separate, if the boundary between self and other is permeable, then what are we really? Are we discrete individuals, or are we temporary arrangements of a larger consciousness that occasionally believes itself to be separate? The horror in Outlast's timeline isn't just about corporate evil or scientific atrocity. It's about the possibility that our comfortable assumptions about reality, identity, and consciousness are not just wrong but actively maintain delusions. The experiments didn't create new capabilities. They revealed capabilities that were always there, suppressed for reasons that might have been protective. Every person who went through the Morphogenic Engine, every resident of Temple Gate who experienced the radio signals, every reagent in the trials, discovered that the self is more fragile and fluid than we pretend. The barriers between minds, between dream and waking, between possible and impossible, are conventions rather than constants. Once these barriers are breached, they can never be fully restored. The variants and their abilities suggest that human consciousness exists on a spectrum we've only explored the safest edge of. Moving along this spectrum grants abilities that seem miraculous projection, manipulation of matter through thought, awareness that transcends space and time. But it also means abandoning the comfortable fiction of individual identity, accepting that we are part of something larger and stranger than we can fully comprehend. Personal stories within the timeline. Throughout this vast timeline of corporate experimentation and consciousness manipulation, individual human stories provide the emotional core that makes the horror resonate. Each test subject, each researcher, each survivor represents a personal tragedy within the larger narrative. Consider the unnamed maintenance worker at Mount Massive, who simply wanted a steady job to support his family. He noticed patients who seemed to appear in multiple places, sections of the facility that felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate, dreams that started featuring the asylum even when he was home. His gradual realization that he was being affected by proximity to the experiments, that his consciousness was being altered without his consent, represents the violation experienced by thousands of Murkoff employees. Or think of the children born in Temple Gate, raised from birth under the influence of the radio signals. They knew no reality other than one where visions were common, where pregnancy could be imagined into existence, where the boundary between belief and fact didn't exist. When the outside world finally discovered them, these children couldn't adapt to consensus reality. They saw things others didn't, believed things that weren't supposed to be possible, and were ultimately institutionalized for refusing to accept the real world. The families of variants represent another kind of tragedy. Imagine having a loved one return from what you thought was a medical trial, seemingly unchanged but somehow fundamentally different. They stare at things that aren't there, speak to people only they can see, and sometimes seem to be experiencing events happening elsewhere. The gradual realization that the person you loved is still there but has become something more and less than human creates a grief that has no resolution. Researchers who began their careers believing they were advancing human knowledge faced their own horrible revelations. Dr. Jennifer Rowland, who led the volunteer variant program at Site Sierra, started as an idealist who thought consciousness expansion could elevate humanity. Watching volunteer after volunteer lose their humanity to gain abilities forced her to confront what she had become: someone who traded human souls for data points. The global response. As evidence of Murkoff's activities accumulated despite their disinformation campaigns, various responses emerged from different sectors of society. Governments quietly established monitoring programs for variant activities, though officially denying their existence. Intelligence agencies attempted to recruit variants for their own purposes, creating a shadow war of consciousness-enhanced operatives. The scientific community split between those who dismissed all evidence of consciousness manipulation as pseudoscience and those who tried to study it within acceptable frameworks. Universities established carefully worded research programs into anomalous cognition and consciousness studies, that were essentially attempting to replicate Murkoff's work through more ethical means. Religious organizations struggled to incorporate the implications of the experiments into their theologies. Some declared variants to be possessed by demons. Others saw them as the next stage in divine evolution. New religious movements emerged claiming that the Morphogenic Engine had revealed humanity's true spiritual nature, that the projection space was actually the afterlife, that consciousness manipulation was the path to enlightenment. The United Nations attempted to establish international protocols for consciousness manipulation experimentation, but enforcement proved impossible. How do you regulate something that officially doesn't exist? How do you prevent experiments that can be conducted through radio waves and internet signals? How do you protect populations from influences they can't perceive? Underground networks formed among survivors and their supporters. They shared information about identifying Murkoff facilities, protecting against consciousness manipulation, and supporting those affected by the experiments. These networks operated like resistance movements, using encrypted communication and secret meetings to avoid corporate surveillance. Technological proliferation. Despite efforts to contain it, Murkoff's technology inevitably spread beyond their control. Former employees sold information to competitors. Hackers stole blueprints and research data. Foreign governments reverse-engineered captured equipment. Within a decade of the Mount Massive incident, dozens of organizations worldwide had some capacity for consciousness manipulation. The black market emerged for morphogenic technology. Crude versions of the engine were constructed in hidden facilities, offering transformation to those willing to pay and risk the considerable dangers. Most of these bootleg operations resulted in deaths or worse subjects trapped between states, neither fully human nor successfully transformed, existing in perpetual agony. Criminal organizations found uses for limited consciousness manipulation, interrogation techniques that could extract thoughts directly from subjects' minds, assassination methods that induced fatal hallucinations, theft accomplished through projection into secure facilities. The technology that Murkoff developed for profit was being weaponized in ways even they hadn't anticipated. More benign applications also emerged. Therapists experimented with controlled projection to treat trauma. Researchers used consciousness manipulation techniques to study the nature of identity and memory. Artists created experiences that allowed audiences to literally share perspectives. The same technology that created horrors at Mount Massive was being explored for its potential benefits. But every application, no matter how well-intentioned, carried risks. The therapy patients who achieved breakthrough healing sometimes couldn't return to normal consciousness. The research subjects who provided valuable data about human cognition occasionally disappeared into their own minds. The art that allowed profound connection between individuals sometimes created permanent psychological bonds that neither party could break. The evolution of horror. As our timeline approaches its conclusion, we must consider how the nature of horror itself has evolved through Murkoff's experiments. Traditional fears, death, pain, loss, have been supplemented by new terrors that previous generations couldn't have imagined. The fear of losing individual identity, of having your consciousness merged with others or dispersed across multiple bodies. The terror of discovering that your thoughts aren't entirely your own, that your decisions might be influenced by signals you can't perceive. The horror of realizing that reality itself is more fluid than you believed, that the solid world might reshape itself based on collective belief or targeted manipulation. Parents now fear not just for their children's physical safety, but for their psychological integrity. Will exposure to certain frequencies alter their development? Are the dreams they report just imagination, or are they accessing something through naturally thin barriers? When they claim to see things others don't, is it childhood fantasy or early variant expression? The workplace carries new anxieties. Is your employer conducting subtle consciousness experiments? Are the team-building exercises actually designed to create low-level psychological fusion? When corporate culture speaks of thinking as one and shared vision, how literal might those concepts become? Even entertainment has become suspect. Are the emotions you feel watching movies purely your own response, or are they being induced through frequency manipulation? When video games seem to know exactly how to engage you, is it good design or consciousness reading? When you find yourself thinking about products you don't remember seeing advertised, is it coincidence or evidence of subliminal projection? The question of consent. Central to the horror of Murkoff's timeline is the complete absence of informed consent. Every experiment, from the earliest MKUltra trials to the current Sleeper project, has involved deceiving or coercing subjects. But this raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of consent in consciousness manipulation. Can someone truly consent to having their consciousness fundamentally altered when they can't comprehend what that alteration means? If successful transformation changes not just capabilities but identity itself, who is giving consent, the person before or after the change? When experiments affect not just individuals, but potentially everyone they interact with, whose consent matters? The Sleeper Project represents the ultimate violation of consent, millions of people being conditioned without their knowledge for potential activation. They live normal lives, unaware that they've been prepared for transformation, that at any moment they might be activated and become something other than themselves. Their families, friends, and communities have also not consented to having potential variants in their midst. Even those who volunteer for experiments, like the subjects at Site Sierra, face questions about the validity of their consent. Were they fully informed of the risks? Could anyone be fully informed when the researchers themselves don't entirely understand what they're doing? When the drive to transcend normal consciousness might itself be induced by conditioning, is the volunteer's desire to participate truly their own? Final observations. As we reach the end of this complete timeline, we find ourselves confronting uncomfortable truths about the nature of consciousness, reality, and human ambition. Murkoff Corporation, in their relentless pursuit of profit through consciousness manipulation, has potentially altered the trajectory of human evolution. Whether this represents progress or catastrophe depends on perspective, and in a world where perspective can reshape reality, that distinction might be meaningless. The facilities may be destroyed, the experiments officially terminated, the corporation legally dissolved, but the knowledge they uncovered cannot be unlearned. Humanity has discovered that consciousness is not fixed, that reality is more malleable than previously believed, that the boundaries between individuals are conventions rather than constants. This knowledge will continue to propagate, evolve, and influence human development, regardless of any attempts to contain it. Every person who has listened to this timeline, who has absorbed this information about consciousness manipulation and reality's flexibility, has been subtly changed by it. Not through any morphogenic frequency or conditioning signal, but through the simple act of considering possibilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about existence. In learning about Murkoff's experiments, we become participants in their continuation. The survivors of Mount Massive, Temple Gate, and the various trial facilities carry more than trauma. They carry evidence that consensus reality is a choice rather than a fact. Their experiences, dismissed as hallucinations or insanity by those who need the world to remain solid and comprehensible, represent cracks in the facade of normal existence through which something larger and stranger can be glimpsed. As you drift toward sleep, consider that dreams might be more than neural noise, that the unconscious mind might access capabilities and connections that waking consciousness suppresses for its own protection. The timeline of Outlast is ultimately about the price of knowledge, not just knowing facts, but knowing that the nature of knowing itself is far stranger than we're comfortable acknowledging. The Murkoff Corporation succeeded in their goal of understanding and manipulating human consciousness. But in doing so, they revealed that human consciousness was never what we thought it was. We are not discrete individuals navigating a solid reality, but temporary arrangements of something larger, existing in a reality that responds to observation and belief. The horror isn't what Murkoff did to their test subjects. It's what their experiments revealed about what we all are. Sleep now, and in your dreams, you might experience echoes of the projection space, glimpses of the collective unconscious, moments where your individual identity softens and blurs. These are not symptoms of exposure to Murkoff technology, but natural expressions of consciousness that have always been possible, now made more apparent by the knowledge that they exist. The timeline concludes but doesn't end. Somewhere, in facilities that don't officially exist, experiments continue. In hospitals and research centers, doctors encounter phenomena that don't fit medical orthodoxy. In homes around the world, children display capabilities their parents don't understand. The transformation of human consciousness that Murkoff initiated proceeds through mechanisms both technological and natural, directed and spontaneous, horrible and potentially transcendent. Thank you for joining me through this complete exploration of the Outlast timeline. May your dreams remain your own. May your consciousness remain coherent. And may you wake tomorrow confident in your individual identity, even knowing that such confidence might be the most necessary and merciful of illusions. Rest well, with the knowledge that the horrors we've explored tonight are, as far as you know, safely contained within fiction. The alternative that consciousness manipulation is real, ongoing, and unavoidable is a possibility better considered in daylight, when the boundaries between self and other, between real and imagined, seem more solid than they do in the dark hours before dawn. The recording ends, but the signal continues carried in the electromagnetic radiation of your device, in the frequencies below conscious perception, in the spaces between sleeping and waking, where human consciousness has always been most fluid, most capable, and most vulnerable to influence from forces we've agreed to pretend don't exist. Good night.